Let's dive into our first question. We are going to those phone lines for a phone and caller.
Dear Melissa, greetings from Barcelona. I'm working in the medtech industry and we're commercializing solutions for patients and healthcare professionals that combine devices and digital products. We need to ensure that we deliver a seamless experience for the entire integrated solution. How would you set up the teams to maximize the overall value considering the different product life cycles? And what about product ops? Should we harmonize it or try to keep it simple and specific? Thank you very much. Looking forward for the answer.
All right, when you're working in a complex portfolio, like something that has hardware and software, we do have different life cycles in those products, and the way that they get built as well is going to be very different. For example, with a hardware product, we're not going to be using the same type of experimentation techniques we might be using in a software product. So we're not going to be doing things like concierge testing or A/B testing or things like that. And that's okay. That's the nature of a hardware product. We can still do things to limit risk there by doing prototypes and testing things that way. There are a lot of hardware components out there that do that. So make sure that you are still testing. But when we think about integrating these things, I think there's a couple different factors you want to think about when structuring your product management team. One, do you have standalone applications versus devices? So, for example, like my sister has a glucose monitor. You can think of a glucose monitor as in your arm. There's no real user interface. You just kind of like shove that thing in there and then it hooks up to your phone. In this case, we want to make sure there's a strong pairing between what the information is on the glucose monitor that's being sent over to the phone, but we don't really have a team that's working on the interface for the monitor. We might have a team that's figuring out, what size it should be, how it should be crafted, how it could be medically up to standards. But we're not going to have the same type of, let's say, product team as we would with a software interface because we're not in there so much. So in this case, you might have a person running the development of those hardware components of that actual medical device. So you might have a head of medical devices and you might have a head of the digital products, and they may be collaborating very closely together about the information they send back and forth, but it's probably not super dependent on the actual glucose monitor right there having the same exact management as the digital health component of it, the things where you go into your app and start looking through it. So in these cases, it's more like we need a team to actually look at the medical devices. We need them to collaborate very, very closely with the software components of it to make sure that there's a strategy as a whole. I'd also say the executive team in this case needs to be working together really closely to make sure that we are in line with how we want to develop this and what's going to win for this product in the market. Because it's not just about the iPhone app winning, let's say, right? It's also about, is this, monitor something small, easy to wear, something that doesn't bother people, things like that. So we need to work in harmony here, but the strategy for the product needs to be in sync. The way that we develop the product is going to look very different. So in some cases, I do see this where we don't have, let's say, one overarching head of product over these two different teams. The hardware team is allowed to work, separately from the product management team, but we do have touch points in collaboration where we are making sure that we're sending the right information back to the digital apps to make sure that people can actually monitor it. So that might be one situation. In other situations, you might have to more tightly couple medical devices and the product management of the digital experience. Things where we have an interface, things where you might be using it differently or signaling somebody to use something differently. Things where you have to get the user experience actually involved in the monitoring or the actions that you need to do for their health. In this case, you want to think about, is there an overarching strategy? And are these two things so tightly coupled, right? Where we need one strategy of how it all works together. And a lot of times you will have that strategy over there, but you want to think about what are the different touch points. If there are frequent touch points between go back to the device, go back to the app, go back to the device, go back to the app, those are things that you're going to have to think about with the strategy a lot more tightly. So in this case, maybe we have one head of product who's looking at both the success of the hardware component and the software components, but we might have different teams underneath them where we have a VP of hardware and we have a VP of software. And that chief product officer on top of them is really making sure that they are, you know, thinking about the strategy of these things, but the teams independently work on the life cycles of their products underneath those two VPs. Now, in this case, you could have them also tightly working together. You need to make sure that collaboration is really working here, and you need to make sure there's a combined strategy about the user journey and how we go back and forth between these things. But your hardware cycles are going to be a lot longer than your software cycles, and that's okay. It's okay to have different teams concentrating on different things. It's okay to say, hey, this is how software works, and these are our touch points in there. Things like agile don't really work very well for hardware companies. You're not going to be using scrum cadences when you're managing a actual physical product. That's just not how we operate, right? Agile was working for software, it's not working for hardware. So you're going to have to look at these two roadmaps to manage those life cycles and make sure the leaders between these two things are working really well together and collaborating around when these things are going to go live, how we're actually going to roll it out, how we test the prototypes, and how they actually go in sync. So you want to think about how you foster those collaborations between those teams. And I said the word collaboration like 18 times here. And I want you to remember that that's key. It's okay not to have one team or one leader on top of everything as long as people collaborate. And as long as we figure out how do we get people to discuss their life cycles, discuss their roadmaps, make the strategies together. If you make the strategies in sync and then you take off to go do your work and then frequently get together to discuss it, you're going to find that it becomes a lot easier to work through these things. But this is something that a lot of companies have worked with before. We had a great episode with Yasi Bayani, who was working with Fitbit, who talks about how they managed the hardware side and how they did the software side. And it is similar to what I'm talking about, where they had two different leaders over those areas, but they collaborated very tightly together. So think about what's going to work best in your case. Think about how you set that strategy together. Now, when it gets into product operations, it depends what you need. Remember, product operations is about enabling the product management team. If you both need data on the hardware side and the software side, which I'm sure you do, and your leaders need that data as well, maybe you have one centralized product operations team that works between the two. If the hardware team has very different, distinct needs from the software team, maybe you can either embed teams there or think about how you streamline those in centralized services if it's going to be beneficial for everybody. So, really, this comes down to thinking through what do people need and how do I purposely build an organization of product operations around that.